What's up, people? I'm here. Who do we have? Say what's up in the chat so I know who I'm working with. How's everyone feeling today? I'm feeling pretty damn good. Even though I had to go on campus today to do some bullshit required training session. Basically what they're doing, and by the way, my voice is shot. I think it might be from doing too many streams and podcasts and shit over the past week. My vocal cords are just gone to shit. Anyway, yeah, academia, they're kind of basically clamping down on everything, trying to make the job more excruciating. And one of the ways they're doing this is with like finances. So in many ways, they're basically trying to hem in the ability for academics to purchase things or to use the whatever little amount of research funding they might have. So now if you want to make a purchase with research funding that you have, even though it's like your money or whatever, you have to do this like new training, and it's like this 2-hour training to be a budget holder because they don't trust you, I guess, with money. Probably because academics buy booze and hookers and shit like that. I've never done that. I've been a good boy. Anyway, now I went to this 2-hour training and today, and man, it sucked. But the good news is now I have complete control over the little bit of funding money that I do have. So I can get whatever I want. Stay tuned for me being subject to some like highly scandalous, sensationalist news story because of whatever I choose to buy. Probably I'll spend most of it on cocaine, and then probably spend the second half of it on probably buying a new video camera to make higher quality YouTube videos. And then I'll take the cocaine and make really high quality YouTube videos. Educational though, purely educational. It's for, this is for my job, so I'll definitely, it's all for the youth, All right. Today we're going to be joined in a little bit by JG Michael. I don't know if he likes to be called that or if I should call him, I think his first name's Joseph, I think I saw. But he's a nice dude. I talked with him at length last week. I did his podcast. Well-educated, insightful guy. So we'll see what he has to say. Pretty random. I don't know too much about his background or what he's into other than what I learned from that one talk with him last week. But yeah, he'll bring some variety into the evening. But for now, there were a few things I wanted to talk about, but I think we'll just cut straight to the juicy one that I've been thinking about today. And I've actually been writing a blog post about this just today. So I want to share it to you. I want to share it with you while it's fresh. Basically, if you look at the data on Trump's opinion ratings, the approval ratings, in fact, I'm going to call it up right here and I'll share my screen with you when I have it up. It has a very interesting pattern. As many of you know, Trump has had relatively quite low approval ratings for his entire term so far. But, they're not, at this stage in his tenure, they're not that low relative to many other previous presidents. And so here, I'll actually show you the data right now, and we'll take a look at it. And I'll kind of make my argument as we're looking at it. So this is approval versus disapproval on the 538.com website. They do really good work with data. And as you can see, in the 30s, 40s at best recently. But for most of Trump's tenure, he's kind of hovered in this 30% approval area, which isn't really great, right? Not exactly getting off to a stellar start. I don't think anyone would say, even his supporters might not. So what's interesting, though, is when you start to look at that in comparison to other previous presidents. And so check out this graph that shows where other previous presidents were at correspondingly, equivalent times or number of days out from their inauguration. And I think you see a quite an interesting pattern. So look at Obama, for instance. In each of these graphs, it shows the top line, the gray line is the other president, and the green line is Trump. So you see the green line is the same in all of these. And what you see that I think is really interesting, by the way, my voice is going to keep cracking because, like I said, it's just shot and deal with it. So by this time in Obama's first term, his approval rating was not that different than Trump's. So here I'm looking at the top left here, in this upper top left box. So interestingly, we think of Obama as someone who got off to a great start. Everyone, hope and change. Everyone was really pumped on Obama at first. But 550 days in, he's not that different than Trump in terms of public approval. Now, George W. Bush is a totally different case because of the war in Iraq. War is known to increase presidential approval. So, and also George H.W. Bush had a similar case. There was a lot of war then. So the Bushes are kind of exceptions to the rule. Don't ignore them for now. George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. But looking primarily at Obama, Clinton, Reagan, and Carter, even to some degree, Gerald Ford down there, you see an interesting pattern, I think, which is that in all of those cases, those people started with higher public opinion ratings. People were generally quite favorable in the early or middle parts of the first term. But over time, they descend towards where Donald Trump is right now. So that actually fits in with something. It's just one data point, obviously. You can't make wild extrapolations from any one particular data point. Obviously, you want to start with theory and test it against the data. It's basic scientific method. So I'm not doing that, but I've had kind of longer standing kind of theoretical intuitions, and this jives with one of them. So I want to take this as an opportunity to sort of tease it out, which is in some the larger thesis and kind of provocation I want to make, and then I'll back it up, is that in some sense Trump might just be an indication of increased or improved social learning, in the sense of the public's calibration of what they can reasonably expect from presidents, just the general average social sophistication of individuals viewing how the political system works and how individuals within it work and what they can offer them or can't offer them. I actually, it's the conventional wisdom is that Trump represents this kind of moment of increased kind of social irrationality, right? That people are getting more and more desperate and making crazier and crazier decisions, electing someone like Donald Trump. But I actually think that Trump might just represent the masses, if you will, getting smarter, actually getting with it in many ways. And so why do I think that? Well, basically, one way to interpret the data I just showed you is that if this sort of level of like 40 to 50% approval rating is kind of where a lot of presidents end up after 550 days, regardless of how they start off or how much they're loved at the beginning. In other words, maybe these other presidents such as Obama, Clinton, Reagan, and Carter, maybe those are just cycles of illusory hope where the public stupidly thinks that some new politician is going to be great. They're going to solve their problems. And that disillusionment gives rise over time. That illusion gives rise over time to increasing disillusionment. But that naivety, that hope or expectation of a politician actually being good, those are the cases of kind of stupidity or lack of sophistication. And so maybe what is one thing that's unique about and interesting about Trump is that in some sense, the data suggests that maybe he's just one of the first presidents in this particular era where people actually have realistically calibrated expectations from the beginning, meaning from day one, there was no, high level of approval with hope and change and all these kinds of grand expectations that here we have someone who's going to do good. But people more or less kind of knew from the beginning, this is not going to be good. We generally don't really approve. He's probably not going to give us what we want. And public opinion as an aggregate kind of reflects that from the beginning. So the stability of public opinion at this low level throughout his term from the beginning, at a level that a lot of the other presidents tend to converge to over time. What that says to me is that maybe Trump is he represents the public kind of having a correctly equilibrated expectation of politicians. Maybe their understanding is increasing in the sense that they sort of know now in advance that every politician is going to suck. It's all sort of a joke. They're not really going to get anything that they really want. And their attitudes are now updated in advance to basically be prepared for this. So if that's the case, then you might reasonably ask, well, why is it that there's so much sort of negative outrage against Trump? Like, why do people hate him so much? Why especially do liberals kind of wring their hands about him? Well, this theory I'm kind of laying out might point the way towards a different explanation for that, which is it's not that Trump is uniquely bad. It's, Trump's approval rating is, as I said, quite close to where it is for many other presidents at this point. But rather, in some sense, what it dramatizes, I think, is that like educated, progressive people, in some sense, the idea that the masses, like large numbers of uneducated people, the idea of those people kind of increasing their political sophistication for themselves and making their own decisions, however wild or stupid those decisions might seem, the idea of like the masses actually becoming more sophisticated actually horrifies like left-leaning progressives, I think, in some deep sense that people are not even really explicitly aware of in themselves. Just because I think the reason I think this makes sense is because if you think about it, the entire modern posture of progressive politics, I don't just mean like contemporary lefties or whatever. I mean like the modern view of politics from whatever, like the French Revolution or however you want to date it. That educated, kind of morally elevated people can get together and kind of guide the polity in a more positive direction, whatever the definition of positive might be. That entire modern posture is kind of predicated on the idea that the dumbest people in society, the most kind of nasty and resentful and violent types of people, in the lefty imagination, that's like, racist, uneducated white people who just want to do harm to, minorities and want to separate, immigrants from their babies. This sort of, these base instincts that are, that do exist, especially among the kind of uneducated, non-self-controlling, unelevated, uncivilized, if you will, parts of, the masses. This is like a large number of people, right? The entire like modern narrative of political progress is predicated on those people not actually being able to figure anything out on their own. It's predicated on those people having to be guided, having to be sort of tutored and controlled, or at least if it's not tutored, then it's explicitly kind of confined and controlled by educated progressive people. And so in some sense, like whatever you think about Trump, it does seem like it's something like, actually some fair number of uneducated, fairly possibly racist people, these sorts of, the people that Hillary Clinton had in mind when she called them the deplorables, these like unsophisticated, uneducated parts of the public are actually kind of getting smarter. Like they realize all of the current politicians over the past several decades don't really help them. They realize that this entire like civilized cultural game is not really working for them. It doesn't have their own interests at heart. And whatever you think about those people and their interests, they're kind of increasing their sophistication. They're realizing what's going on and they're updating their attitudes and behaviors accordingly. And I think even if you dislike what they believe or stand for, they are actually accurate to change their strategy significantly. And even if that means like electing someone who we find, kind of insane or ridiculous or incompetent or whatever, they're right to want someone from the outside of this civilized cultural game to step in and fuck it up in their defense. They're right to want that. And I would even say they're reasonable, at least, to take some gambles on that, because their prospects are quite dire in many cases. So basically what I'm getting at is the left is not horrified at Trump because he's a uniquely bad president. He's probably not much better or worse than many previous presidents, simply because presidents don't have that much power. And that's something that people learn and the public learns over time. And you see that in the data. But the left is so uniquely horrified because what it really represents is the unruly masses getting out of the control of like educated progressive guidance, which that's the entire model of like the modern progressive posture of seeing and acting around politics. So that, I think, is basically my little thought for the day. I was writing about this earlier in the morning. And yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense to you? Is that interesting? Is that useful? I don't know. You have to tell me. Luke says that, do you think that 538 data might not show the opinion polarization of the different political groups? On aggregate, the polls are similar. The spread could be far larger. Yeah, that's probably right. The polarization of the approval ratings is almost certainly stronger right now than it would have been, a decade ago, 2 decades ago. That, based on everything we know about polarization dynamics, that is very likely to be true. So good point. Very good point. And when I say, there's a question about, am I talking about liberalism or leftism? And honestly, I don't have a good solution for that because I live in Europe and my language still just kind of oscillates wildly among leftists and liberals. The thing is, here's the thing. For a while, I've said, when I talk about American liberals, Democratic Party, types of people, I've generally used the word leftist because that's kind of more European friendly. And it also makes sense in the context, the other kind of international context. Saying liberal is really confusing. So I try not to use the word liberal for meaning left because it doesn't really scale well to international topics. But having said that, then I start disliking the word lefty or leftist or the left, because when I use that term a lot, then I feel like I'm like fucking Ben Shapiro or something. And I don't want to be always going on about like the leftists, like I'm not, I actually think it's a lot of the things that I'm most interested in and that I talk a lot about it's not like a myopic beef with like the left or leftists. It's often, for me, I think, my target in a lot of my arguments and ideas is a much broader posture that I think goes back at least to the French Revolution. It's kind of like the modern, Whiggish political type, I think, is what I'm really getting at. And so, yeah, sorry if I oscillate. Sometimes I'll call that leftist. Sometimes I'll call it progressive. Sometimes I'll call it, liberal if I'm referring to American context. But actually, I mean, this is one thing that liberals, both in the sense of classical liberal and American, Democrat liberals and leftists, have in common. And this is something that I think people should think way more about and talk way more about, which is that, the much more general category of whatever you want to call it, like modern, the modern progressive posture, or the Whig, or there are lots of different competitor or candidate terms for this longer term kind of modern figure, the modern type of educated, sophisticated, modern perspective on politics, basically, is often what I'm targeting. That is something that is shared by leftists and the people today who call themselves classical liberals. So, I mean, this is something that I think is really under discussed. Like, the people like whatever, like Dave Rubin and Eric Weinstein and those types, they have a certain thing in common with even like the leftists that they disagree with and often criticize, which is that they're all more or less on the same page in the following sense of the page. The shared page that they're on is that the job of human beings today is to think critically about how institutions function and to imagine sort of high-level control mechanisms or manipulations that, intelligent, creative people can pull to kind of optimize or improve or push forward social arrangements in a way that is desirable. I mean, almost everyone who talks smart about politics today is on that shared page. And that's something that classical liberals have in common with leftists. Of course, classical liberals are a little bit more agnostic. They're a little bit more libertarian. They don't want to, they don't want the government to do as much. And that's a meaningful cleavage within that, between classical liberals and leftists. But classical liberals and leftists do imagine themselves in similar ways in this larger modern sense. They imagine themselves as critical rationalists who are identifying problems in society and using their intellect and public communication to fundamentally push the world into a better place. That is the larger model. And often with a lot of my arguments, what I'm really targeting is that much larger, longer standing posture, really, which I think has been around, which kind of characterizes the typical person really in modernity. It's kind of the average man of modernity, arguably, you could say, has this kind of typical posture towards politics. All right. So I'm realizing that my voice is actually like more shot than I thought it was. It's actually getting kind of hard to talk and project. And I also sound probably pretty scratchy. So what we'll do is we'll have JG on. We'll chat. Hopefully he'll take the mic for a lot of it and he'll spare my vocal cords. Pardon me. But I think also I will ask him if we can make this one a relatively short one, because yeah, it's actually kind of starting to hurt. I didn't think it was that bad. I had my tea, but bitter green tea. I'm with tea. I always leave the tea bag in too long. So whenever I drink tea, it's bitter as fuck, but it's strong. So I like that. Anyway, I guess for the next 6 minutes, I can do a little bit of housekeeping. Most of you will have seen by now that I dropped the Nickland podcast, which people have, really responded favorably to. I've heard from a lot of people that they got a lot out of it. So I'm really delighted by that. I think that's really, really glad that I had that opportunity to talk with them at such length. I'm glad people liked it. What else? I've mentioned before in the past, and it's still going. I'm still working on it. It's happening just slowly and surely. I'm building a little private community. So for the few of you out there listening to this, if you haven't done so already, and this is something that interests you, if you're, I know a lot of people already have a bunch of different communication channels like WhatsApp groups and Telegram channels and Slack channels, and lots of people already have too much communication and community in their life in that sense. So if that's you, that's cool. Honestly, don't sign up for more distracting community and stuff like that. But if your current menu or diet of communication and community is not what you really want, if you feel like you're still looking for, a certain kind of intellectual connection or community or camaraderie or whatever that you still haven't quite found yet, and you think, other people who are interested in the stuff I'm doing and have been kind of coming to my streams and joining the chats and stuff like that. If you think these themes or these people who have been kind of hanging out with me are maybe people you would like to talk more with, and you'd also like to talk more with me, I am building this private chat community. And so just shoot me a message. It's not public yet. I don't know actually if it will ever be public, but it's not exclusive either. I just want to, build it out slowly and surely. So basically, that's the pitch. If that's something that interests you, shoot me a DM on Twitter or shoot me a message on here or leave a reply or whatever. What exactly am I doing? It's nothing special. It's just a little private discussion community. It's a Discord server. So it's a fairly common thing to do nowadays. Lots of people have these. There's nothing too special about it. There's no like grand idea or scheme behind it. But it's just for basically people that are interested in all these themes that I've been working on for a while and that I'm talking about. And yeah, people who are just kind of interested in the stuff I'm putting out and the related themes. If they, want to talk to me more or more frequently or more directly, that's kind of going to be where I'm going to be hanging out and kind of building up a little active, like everyday community space for people to talk and hang out. And Discord is pretty dope because, you can make all these different bots to do all these cool different things. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking about it from the perspective of like, social institutional design and community engineering. Like I'm kind of interested in creating one myself and kind of having creative control over, the rules and the norms of like what I think would be like the most ideal conditions for like a healthy, thriving, mutually empowering community of people trying to think and talk and about the topics that I'm interested in, basically. So yeah. So if you want to join, just shoot me a message, basically. Shoot me a DM on Twitter or leave a reply in the video, or you can say it in the chat, but I may or may not be able to find it later. So yeah, for now, basically what I'm doing is I'm rolling it out slowly. So I'm basically bringing in batches of people at a time and then improving the community as it goes. So yeah, if you're interested, shoot me a message. But I will say, actually, it's kind of taking off, I think, in a way that I think is quite healthy. We don't have too many people in it yet, but there is, I would say, a healthy little microculture that is starting to brew. People are having like pretty interesting, fairly high level discussions, and then also just some sort of fun like little things also. For me, there's admittedly like a self-interested kind of perspective, because what I really would like, one thing I would really like personally is input and feedback from people that watch my shit and have an interest in what I do. Like I want to know what people want me to do, suggest guests to me, suggest topic ideas to me, ask questions of me to give me, motivation and inspiration and guidance on like what people find most interesting and valuable about the stuff I'm putting out. So that's definitely like very transparently part of what I'm trying to get out of it. And then in return, I want to kind of invest in creating a space that is edifying and interesting and stimulating for people also. So yeah, nothing too special about it. Lots of people already have these. And like I said, if you already have too many of those, don't send me a message, because I don't want people to have more distractions in their life than they need. But ideally, it won't be a distraction. It'll be, like I have some ideas for how to make it, kind of an anti-distraction, to actually make it feed into people's productive ventures. That's really kind of what my engineering mind wants to do with this Discord server I'm making, is kind of creatively engineer it in a way that doesn't distract people and kind of suck their attention and suck their typing and suck their energy, but can be used as a kind of social motivator for people to write more in the direction that they want to write more, to think more in the direction they want to think more, and to make stuff together and collaborate and stuff like that. And to, yeah, like I said, have more guidance over the stuff that I do, if that's something that you're interested in. All right, enough about that. So that was my opening pitch about Trump's approval. I hope you found that interesting. Let me know if you think that's a plausible argument I was making or not. Now it's time to invite in JG Michael, and we're going to talk about lots of things like horror and hopefully Adorno. I know he's a fan of Adorno. We talked about it briefly in my podcast, but I want to talk about that more now that we have an opportunity to do so. So let me just get the link and email that to him right now. All right, so he should be with us any minute. In the meantime, I'll rest my vocal cords. What I need is some sort of like music right now that I can just hit play and it's kind of like make a chill atmosphere. I take a break. We wait for people. Someone asked me in the chat if this community that I'm making is part of a research inquiry. No, not at all. Not like, I mean, in some sense, everything as an intellectual, like everything you do should be part of research in some sense. You should be trying to learn from everything you do. In that sense, yeah. But no, it has nothing to do with any kind of planned, like formal academic research project. Certainly not. No, basically, I mean, all this stuff I'm doing is trying to build, spaces and sustainable, energies that are like outside of academia completely is what I'm really ideally trying to do, I think. Hey, JG, no worries. Take your time. JG is having slight technical difficulties. So the good thing is I have a million ideas at all times, and I can easily generate words. So that's not a problem, man. Even though my voice is shot, I got this. Should I talk about the Nickland podcast? I think, to be honest, the people who gave Nickland a lot of shit over the past years and didn't let him speak at places like the shutdown LD50 campaign, I want to call them out. I think they're really cowardly, and I think they should be ashamed of themselves. Personally, I think the shutdown LD50 people should be ashamed of themselves. I think they're cowards. I think the new Center for Research and Practice, I think they should be ashamed of themselves also. I know Mo. I'm not well, but I talked with him. Seems like a nice guy. Nothing personally against him, but as an institution, the new Center for Research and Practice should be ashamed of itself for cutting off Nickland, I think. I think that basically there's just a lot of cowardice in academia and activist-y types. And, these are mostly people who, don't even have the time or energy to really read deeply into, massive, crazy blogs like Xenosystems or whatever. They look at things briefly. They ask, is this too dangerous for my public image? Is this going to, threaten or jeopardize my career and my kind of self-interested motives and goals, and in the milieus that I am trying to promote myself? And they basically just decide this is too dangerous for me to touch, so we can't allow Nickland to speak here, or we can't allow Nickland to give a seminar, even though he's obviously whatever you want to say about Nickland, dangerous, sure. Maybe he said some things that you find totally wrong, maybe even ethically evil. That's fine. You can think that. I don't know everything he's ever said. I would even consider the possibility that maybe there's something in writing somewhere that someone could point to me and say, I would even say, I find that to be false and wrong and even evil. That could happen. That could exist. I actually don't know if I've personally seen anything he's like written or said that is so evil personally. But I would even grant that it might exist, and I might even admit that. But if someone is brilliant, you should be interested in talking with them. It's that simple, even if they're a little bit evil. I am actually not convinced that Nick is evil. But even if someone is evil, if they're sufficiently brilliant, you should talk with them. I think that is an ethical obligation, and also just an obvious decision for anyone who's a genuine intellectual. Like, if you're really trying to get to the bottom of things, you're going to choose to risk it in favor of talking with someone who might have insights that you really want or need, even if they have other thoughts or feelings or positions or statements that you find wrong or even ethically unconscionable. That's what I think. And I think if you choose to not talk with someone or to classify them as a pariah or to exclude them from spaces or to actively organize, especially if you're actively organizing to make someone unable to speak in a public domain. I'm sorry, but I'm going to assume, or not assume, but I'm going to infer with some good reason that you're probably either just a coward, or you're just stupid, or you're just interested in your public image, and that's your main priority. So yeah, that's just a little, you know, I generally don't pick fights, and I'm not interested in like drama. But after the podcast with Nickland, you know, I thought it was sufficiently interesting and insightful, and I heard from enough people who found it genuinely useful, and like you know, brilliant people, however dangerous or however dubious some of their ideas might be, brilliant people are able to open doors and unlock things for potentially a large number of other people. And that's essentially an emancipatory or liberatory, you know, freedom, justice, and equality increasing type of phenomenon ultimately. And so, yeah, I think I don't really pick fights, and I'm not interested in, you know, useless drama. But sometimes you got to call people out, and you got to just be honest about what you think is really going on. Not to stir shit, but just because when people are shameful and act in shameful ways or are patently cowardly, you know, you're doing yourself and everyone else a disservice to not just simply call a spade a spade. And yeah, sometimes you feel like doing that. Sometimes you need to do just a little bit of that. Are you with us now, JG? Michael, can you hear me? Oh, wait, hang on. Maybe I can't hear you. So can you hear me? All right, JJ, I see you, but I don't hear you. Is there something wrong with me? Let me check. No, I don't think so. So I can just keep talking. Feel free to step in. Oh, your microphone is paused. It looks like that might be it. Anyway, just speak up whenever you get it sorted. I can answer Left Cat's question. So Left Cat in the chat just asked if I ever worry that I'm undermining my own left positions by pandering to the right. Do you feel like you should critique or challenge the right? Why or why not? I definitely don't think I'm pandering to the right, like at all. Okay, so I mean, I would say at least like 40% of everything I've written in the past year has either explicitly or implicitly motivations of figuring out how communism can really work. Basically, that may or may not be apparent, and it definitely will be variably apparent. But I mean, many of the pieces I've written in the past year are explicitly trying to theorize communism in a way that is consistent with empirical reality and other concepts such as patchwork. I think that's been quite explicit in a lot of the stuff I've been putting out. And then even the stuff that's where it's not so explicit, like all of the data analysis research that I've been doing on ideological distributions of like the new ideological subcultures, like all of that is trying to unpack the current reality of contemporary ideology. It's not like taking a left or right wing stance. It's trying to unpack the nature of what left and right even mean and who's who. So I would say a very, very small minority of anything I say and do could even be reasonably interpreted as like pandering to the right. Like I don't think anything I say or do is pandering to the right, but I'm saying, you know, even the stuff that could be taken by someone as possibly pandering to the right, that even that stuff is just a relatively small minority of what I put out. Left Cat, I would be very intrigued to hear your response to that if you find that, you know, if you buy that or not. Sorry, JG, can you hear me now? Can people in the chat hear? Is he talking? I can't hear anything. Am I missing something? I don't think your microphone. There's something wrong with your input, I think, Mike JG. Yeah, no one can hear you. We see you. We see your icon, your avatar. Maybe try a different browser. I'm not sure. I want to hear from Left Cat. I want to know if Left Cat found my answer convincing or not. I mean, I've heard this objection sometimes. I've gotten this from a few people, like, why do I pander to the right? And I really don't see it. I really don't think I'm doing that. Okay, yeah. Well, I appreciate the comment because it's an opportunity to respond to it. So yeah, people look at like the blog post about Kekistan as pandering to the right. But look, one of my main talking points from all the research that I've done over the past year is that a major group within the current group that is called alt-right, of all the people that are called alt-right, a massive slice of those people are straight up traditional leftists. And no one really has data on this. You can't really tease this out from like big national public surveys because all this stuff is so new and they don't have questions about like who's alt-right and stuff like that. But I've gone at this question with a very objective, fine-tooth comb, using whatever tools I have available to me as a political scientist to try and measure and estimate like what is the actual ideological distribution within the groups that are called alt-right. That's why I'm studying many groups that are associated with the alt-right, but that's not at all pandering. It's actually quite the opposite. I'm trying to not save, but I'm doing it all, out of a motivation to honor and kind of represent the left wing, the genuine left wing of the kind of whole entire kind of anti-politically correct like counterculture, if you will, that just currently by the mainstream culture gets labeled alt-right. So it's fundamentally leftist motivation, to be honest. I'm trying to tease the left out of what currently gets labeled the alt-right. Not to pander to the alt-right, but because for that reason, the alt-right is an interesting site right now. All right. Can you hear me now, JG Michael? Oh, I'm not hearing you, man. I don't know what could be wrong. Maybe we could do something where you like call me on the phone and I'll like play the audio. There must just be something up with your inputs, unless there's something wrong with the way I've set it up, but I'm pretty sure not, because I've done a bunch of these. So, oh, JG, go to the settings? Are you checking that you have the right microphone selected? So if you click the gear icon in the Google Hangout, you might need to change whatever microphone is being selected or something like that. I'm not sure. There you go. I hear you now. Can you hear me?
You can hear me?
Yes, I got you. Finally.
Okay.
All right. Thanks for joining with me. Dude, I don't know if you can hear. I don't know if you can tell, but my voice is pretty fucked. So my talking abilities are going to be relatively limited. So maybe we'll do a relatively short one if that's okay with you, because I'm already kind of starting to chafe.
Yeah, that sounds okay.
I'm just letting you know now because it has nothing to do with your performance in this conversation or anything like that.
Yeah. So where did you want me to start out?
Yeah, we can start wherever you want. Is there anything on the tip of your mind that you're especially amped to riff on, or would you like me to ask you some questions to guide us into this conversation?
Well, I know you wanted to talk about one of the essays I wrote. It's called Weird Hoarders Conceit. But first, I just want to briefly introduce myself.
Great.
I'm JG Michael. I do some freelance work for Zero Books, which is a left-wing publishing outlet. I host the podcast Alternatives over there on their Inside Zero Books feed for Patreon subscribers. So I talk about all kinds of weird counterculture stuff on that show with my co-host C. Derek Varn. And I also have another podcast called Parallax Views, which I think you've linked that on the YouTube page, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and I also write on the side for a website called Modern Mythology, which is where the article Weird Horrors Conceit is at. And I think a lot of your viewers would really like what Modern Mythology has to offer, because it's a website ran by a guy, Jamie Curcio, and Jamie is one of the first people to have done this sort of retro futurist aesthetic. He's part of a whole milieu of people out of the East Coast of the United States that was promoting that aesthetic in the late 90s and early 2000s. So he sort of has an inside track on, a lot of the culture that arose out of, the industrial music scene and the retro futurist aesthetic. So I would really recommend your viewers check out Jamie Curcio's work and his website, modernmythology.com.
Cool. Thank you.
Or modernmythology.net.
Okay.
So Weird Horrors Conceit, the essay you wanted me to talk about, I wrote it in response to Nickland, actually, a Twitter exchange I saw of his. And Nickland was arguing with a transhumanist, which I assume your viewers are pretty familiar with that, probably.
Right.
Transhumanism.
Probably. Yeah, probably.
And there was this girl who sort of supports transhumanism that was saying, it's going to be such a wonderful future when I can, be augmented by whatever this futurist technology is. And Nickland said, in response to her, when transhumanism is nice, it doesn't make any sense. And when it makes sense, it isn't at all nice. And the essay Weird Horrors Conceit sort of bounces off of that, because I'm not sure that, regardless of what one thinks of transhumanism, whether it's realistic or not, I'm not sure that the sort of change in the human form that would come theoretically with transhumanism necessarily has to be horrifying.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So help us unpack that argument a bit. Why do you think that?
Well, so Nickland, a lot of his style is sort of very much influenced by horror aesthetics. His main project right now is what he calls abstract horror, and he's very similar in his ideas of horror to like H.P. Lovecraft, who is the guy who famously created the Cthulhu mythos.
Yep.
The issue that I sort of see with, well, let's start with his famous essay, The Dark Enlightenment, because that's where you really see his Lovecraft influence.
Okay.
So in The Dark Enlightenment, he's sort of dealing with all these fears that traditionalists and ethno-nationalist types have regarding things like race mixing, which to me isn't really a problem. I'm not scared of those things in any way, but he sort of plays with those fears. But then halfway through the essay, he says that we're approaching a bionic horizon. Those are his words, the bionic horizon. And the bionic horizon is this point where, we'll be mutated, so to speak, by technology. and he looks at the Western traditionalists that he's been addressing in this whole essay, the Dark Enlightenment essay, and he says miscegenation doesn't get close to the issue once we start considering this bionic horizon. And then he quips, think face tentacles. So he's playing with this sort of Lovecraft idea of, you know, the outside coming in, you know, us being transformed by something that is alien, right?
Yeah. And my intuitions are definitely with you that I'm not at all convinced that has to be a horrifying process. So I mean, I could definitely go off on this also, but I want to hear a little bit more from your perspective. Like what is like the less horrible or less horrifying version of this?
Well, I mean, it gets into like the root of it with Lovecraft, because I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of like Lovecraft's horror writing. I think it's really great, but at the same time, there's a really fatal conceit in Lovecraft's writing, where Lovecraft assumes that anything that is different from what he has already experienced, you know, or that is foreign to him, is automatically bad. He cannot deal with change on any level. Lovecraft is pathologically afraid of the world he inhabits, and we see this in a lot of his own writing. For instance, the horror at Red Hook, which is one of his more notoriously racist weird tales that he wrote. And it's really fueled on this idea of fear of the other.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's a good point. Yeah.
Well, the issue I have with this is that, yes, we are afraid of that idea of otherness, right? You know, there's a lot of fears about, you know, even transhumanism. It's a scary idea to a lot of people, right? Because, you know, post-human necessarily implies, you know, going beyond the human condition, and most people would think of that as a sort of death in and of itself of the human being as a form. So that's scary to a lot of people. But there is also in humanity a desire for transcendence, and we see this throughout all of our history, specifically in religion, and we see that in the idea of transfiguration.
Yeah, or the beatific vision.
Right, and that's what I talk about in the article. The crux of the article is that, you know, there's the story where Jesus takes his apostles to pray atop a mountain shortly before his death, and there he's briefly transformed into this like radiant figure, you know. And the prophets Moses and Elijah, they appear in the sky and declare him the son. You know, it's this moment where he transcends his human form, right?
Yeah.
So I reference that in the essay because there's this idea that contact with the outside can only lead to disfiguration. But my argument is it can also lead to transfiguration or a form of transcendence.
Right.
I hope I'm explaining all this. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. You're being very, very clear for sure. And I think I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, something I've thought a lot about for a while is that there could very well be one kind of empirical diagram for this process, but depending on how one is oriented towards it, and depending on factors such as one's own temperament, one can give this a linguistic description that has a very positive valence or a very negative valence. And you know what I mean? Like there could be one underlying reality to it. There might be even so, but among the horrorists and among the, the Christian dream of positive rapture, and the Lovecraftian nightmares of horror, there could be one convergent shared empirical model where there's not actually there's not actually a fundamentally different worldview between these two interpretations. They just have wildly different aesthetic registers and also kind of felt emotional responses. Do you think that's plausible?
Yeah, I think that's very plausible. A lot of the essay I wrote actually sort of bounces off the ideas of this other author who's dealt with Nickland before. Her name is Elizabeth Sandifer, and she has a book out that I would recommend called Neo-Reaction, a Basilisk. And she takes a very critical view of Nickland and neo-reaction, although at the same time, it's interesting. Elizabeth takes she can't help but find Nickland endearing in a lot of ways. It's kind of interesting, and I think that's the experience of a lot of people.
Yeah.
But Elizabeth Sandifer argues in Neo-Reaction, a Basilisk, this idea of the outside that we find so horrifying. We can view it either that way, where it's like, we can't deal with this type of change, or we can accept the sort of mutilation of the body by these outside forces. For the Western traditionalists or ethno-nationalists, that means miscegenation or race mixing. For the people that are anti-transhumanist, that means being augmented by new technologies, right? Well, Elizabeth Sandifer in the book argues, well, maybe we can find new ways of being through that sort of disfiguration. Maybe it's not even a disfiguration at all, is what I would argue. It's a transfiguration. Maybe these new forms can we can accept that outside and sort of become one with it.
Right. Yeah, I'm definitely sympathetic to that. So, I mean, I'm trying to think like what, I guess, because in my talk with Nickland, we had this really interesting exchange where I was basically trying to pin him down on like why it is that a lot of his early writings have a very kind of left-wing flavor, and he seemed in the 90s to be quite bullish on all the opportunities afforded by digital technologies for essentially creative human activity that has something of a connotation of emancipatory or liberating.
There's all that stuff about I think it's in the essay Meltdown in Feng Numina, where he's talking about like trans Chinese hookers and stuff, and but he almost views sort of lesbians and trans
yes, yeah,
as sort of this liberatory force, that can actually break us free of our old ways of being and our old ways of thinking about things.
That's right. Also, in other essays in Fang Nomina, there's a lot of references to like third world countries and women as again having these kind of possibly emancipatory roles in kind of global resistance really to capitalism in some sense. Obviously, I'm just talking about certain connotations. One gets this impression here and there. So I was basically just trying to ask him like what's up with all of that and your more reactionary views now. And what we had this one really interesting little point of condensed insight, I think, where he was like, he's like, all of the stuff you're saying about emancipation, he's like, I would never use the word emancipation, but you can say that if you want to, as long as you're willing to see that emancipation is strictly equivalent to dehumanization. and also there's another part where I forget I don't want to misquote. I forget exactly what he said, but there was another part where that was basically an equivalence was drawn between that and capital autonomization. So we really kind of drilled down into this interesting little formula where he was like willing to give me all my stuff about emancipation, but as long as that's translated into what I think he also sees as roughly synonymous, which is capital autonomization and dehumanization. So again, I think that's kind of he was kind of I think he was kind of agreeing with what you and I are saying now, potentially. Like I don't think he would object to what you and I are saying. But it's an interesting question, like what is the factor that determines like which one of those linguistic registers you want to use? Like
there was an interesting point that can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. You're good.
Okay. There was an interesting point. I don't know if it was you or Nick that said it. Something about like the ripping apart of the human subject. That's sort of where we need to go with things. I think. Right. Yeah, I found that. I mean, it gets at the crux of this idea of emancipation, because I'm not sure if we are ripping apart the human subject, I'm not sure how you can have emancipation, because emancipation as sort of this idea requires an experiencer, which would be the human subject. So
Right. Well, I guess the idea is, I mean, I've written about this a little bit. I've tried to think about this a fair bit, like in my essay, my last essay for vastabrupt.com, like the Twitter, the cave Twitter people that I talk a lot with. Yeah.
Interesting.
I tried to kind of write at length about a kind of like communist interpretation of atomization dynamics, basically, like, because I'm very sympathetic to the empirical view that it sure as hell looks like modernity is this kind of empirical process where increasing fragmentation is the order of the day, and things do appear to be getting chopped up. The modern subject does appear to be getting chopped up, among many other things getting chopped up. So if that is the empirical reality, there's this kind of fundamental tendency towards atomization of many things. Then what would it look like to try to move in the direction of emancipatory communities or communism, really, given this empirical reality, if one were interested in if one were still interested in the stream of communism? And I try to basically argue in that piece that the atomization of the modern subject, the fragmentation of modern subjectivity can be consistent with a liberatory politics, in the sense that it's not like you're getting rid of your entire, the person who experiences, but you're separating those into sub-personalities, really. And
okay. I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah. So it's like, you're not like getting rid of your own consciousness. You're saying that my individual consciousness is actually composed of multiple subconsciousnesses. And like every bourgeois subject is actually already a commune of their own. They're already a commune of subpersonalities. And so one can kind of roll with the process of fragmentation and atomization, atomize one's own bourgeois subjectivity. And in accepting that process and kind of rolling with that process, you're actually creating your own commune, in some sense, a commune of one that then, because it's atomized and subdivided, can merge more creatively in a number of ways with other atomized subjectivities. That's kind of the vision I tried to sketch out.
Right. I mean, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. It gets, I mean, we have to look for these I'll take a line from Guattari and say we have to look for new lines of flight, and I think that's what you're trying to do, as well as a lot of other people.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. That's the slogan, no doubt.
I'd have to think about what you're saying, though. I'd probably have to give it a little bit more time to think about. I mean,
Oh yeah, sure.
as long as we're not talking about because I think a lot of people, and I mean, maybe you can help me out with this, because sometimes the way I've seen Cave Twitter and Nickland talk about these things, right? Sometimes it can get confusing as to whether we're speaking metaphorically or if we're speaking literally, if that makes sense,
Sure. Yeah.
especially with regards to the sort of apocalyptic, like Skynet type, language. So you see it more as metaphorical.
What in particular do I see as metaphorical?
Well, you're saying you're not saying the human subject is being ripped apart, as in that there is no human subject anymore. You're saying we're being sort of atomized further and further and further. Yeah.
Right. Well, I see. I mean, I guess I see it as fairly literal in the sense that, yeah, I think modernity is this long process in which our subjectivity is being fragmented. So, like, my mental experience right now is fundamentally more divided and split and fragmented than the average person of my age,
Right.
like 300 years ago. I do think that, yeah. And so I think that's been a slow process. I think it has a lot of signposts, like even something as simple as, I mean, I think one really major moment in this was psychoanalysis, right? And the basic idea of the unconscious, the basic idea that we have these different drives. Modern psychology is kind of based on this kind of radical disruptive idea that like this unified cogito that we kind of think we inhabit and try to inhabit is not unified. It actually is split up into component parts. And once that enters the public consciousness, then it kind of seeps into our own, experience of subjectivity. And then I think it has real effects in dividing it. And then there are also more, mundane ways of seeing like the real non-metaphorical fragmentation of the subject. Like, even if you just think about the division of labor, I mean, as the modern capitalist division of labor has become increasingly complexified, the reality is like we actually are different things for different people in increasingly different numbers of contexts, So it's like on any one given day, I have to be one type of person for my wife, and then I have to be one type of person for my students. And this is kind of like the norm now for being a person in modern capitalism in a way that it just wasn't before our society was so complex and differentiated. So I inclined to see that as a pretty serious and real literal thing. I mean, to answer your question about, sort of like the accelerationist, like milieu more generally, Cave Twitter and all these different sorts of little microcultures on the internet. I think you're fair to point out that there's a variety of different styles that are kind of participating in this sort of culture, and people are using language in really different ways. I think like there's, as Nickland and some people like CCRU, they were into theory fiction, as I'm sure you know. And so there's this kind of idea that, the difference between serious theory and making shit up is kind of blurred, and that's cool. And one should run with that. And I'm quite sympathetic to that personally, but I am a social scientist. I mean, ultimately most of what I say and think and write is like from a pretty hard-nosed empirical perspective. Personally, I honestly don't think that's like better or worse than theory fiction. Since you're asking, I'm just kind of clarifying. Most of the way I think about these things is pretty concrete and empirically, or at least intends to be, empirically real. I think some people are more creative, I think.
Right. Well, it's interesting because, like, for me, as long as there is we have some type of consciousness, whether it's becoming more and more fragmented or not, there's always sort of a potential path for, this idea of exit. So
right.
I'm actually fairly I'm a fairly optimistic person. It's kind of interesting.
What do you go on? What's your optimistic inclination?
Like I said, I think we can. I mean, the whole point of this essay that I wrote, the weird horrors conceit. I
Yeah.
mean, we can look at these terms literally or metaphorically or figuratively, whatever, right? But the whole point I'm trying to make in the essay is that we can either move with the tides and the waves of change,
Mm-hmm.
or we can resist them. And I think the revolutionary act is to move with them, and allow ourselves to be changed and transformed in ways we may have never imagined possible.
I think that's very well put.
And I think that's what you're getting at. Yeah.
I think that is increasingly how I see things also. And I think that you basically just affirmed the basic kind of accelerationist wager. Especially for I think that to be perfectly frank, I think that left accelerationism has not really been seriously attempted as much as it could have, because so much of contemporary left-wing culture is just completely and absolutely fixated on this idea that you have to oppose capital, basically. And so long as that's kind of one of your key premises, you're going to be inevitably positioning yourself as resisting things. And that's a fundamentally non-accelerationist tendency, I think. And so I'm with you. I think we're at a point where the only possible pathway will involve going with the flow, as it were. But how to do this in a way that represents and gives full expression to traditionally left-leaning priorities or visions or preferences, I think still remains woefully under-theorized, is my view.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's interesting because it sort of gets back to a lot of this goes back to the ideas of Deleuze, where we can sort of see Deleuze as almost saying, instead of resisting this emerging at the time he was writing this emerging neoliberalism, maybe the only way out is to go forward with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have certain issues with that in so much, and maybe this is we've talked about moralism before. Maybe I'm too moralistic about it, and I feel that there's a definite human cost in that
Sure.
we can't forget either. So it's something that I think it's very difficult to parse out, and I think a lot of these things are really under theorized. I've been meaning lately to get more into the works of people like Nick Chernisek. Is that how you pronounce his name? Platform Capitalism.
I only met him one time, but I think you say Cyrinicek.
Okay, yeah. I think it may be interesting looking at those ideas, and now I guess more recently there's this trend of xenofeminism that Helen Haster and a few others are promoting. I think those may be that may be an interesting area to get into it at a later point.
Sure. Do you want to briefly tell me? Do you want to talk about Adorno a little bit? Are you game for that?
Yeah. Whatever you want to talk about. Adorno interested me more for just almost sociological reasons, particularly minimum moralia, because, first, for viewers that may not be as familiar with Adorno was one of the major thinkers of the Frankfurt School, which the dreaded Frankfurt School that supposedly brought around what Jordan Peterson calls what does he call it now?
Cultural Marxism.
Well, yeah, he used to call it cultural Marxism. Now he calls it postmodern neo-Marxism, I guess.
Yeah, nice.
Generally speaking, there's this whole conspiracy theory that's been made about the Frankfurt School. And as with most good conspiracy theories, there's maybe a grain of truth to it. But there's this idea that, I mean, cultural Marxism, when you really take it back to the original people that were using the term, people like Paul Gottfried and Pat Buchanan, it's really a dog whistle type word. They're sort of like people like Paul Gottfried are actually sort of saying that the Frankfurt School was a group of Jewish intellectuals that were trying to undermine Western civilization. Right. And it's interesting because Gottfried was one of the first people to use the term cultural Marxism. But oddly enough, he was trained by Herbert Marcuse. A lot of people don't know that.
Oh, that's
and Herbert Marcuse was another member of the Frankfurt School. But it's interesting because I don't believe in that conspiracy theory, and I actually think Adorno has a lot in common with people like Jordan Peterson in some ways.
Right. Yeah, we talked about that on your podcast, I think. I totally agree.
Yeah, he has a certain, I mean, I think a lot of people would think of it as sort of elitist attitudes. I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with that either, but Adorno feels like we have to have a real sense of culture rather than, this manufactured, sort of pop culture that we're given on a daily basis by the culture. I think he calls it the culture industry.
That's right. Yeah.
That's and I think he gets into some really interesting ideas there because I mean, a lot of people on the right now and the left would both say, that we sort of have this culture industry that sort of breeds, the most base, or maybe debased type of culture imaginable, where we're just sort of rat racing or, and not thinking about things. And
yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that this is ultimately, I've said many times, I'm actually quite interested in Jordan Peterson. I think he's actually quite smart, and I think a lot of his stuff is quite interesting personally. But one of his major weak points that I'd really want to spend more time thinking about and maybe writing about is that what a lot of people don't understand is that all of the cultural ills that he's like really obsessed with calling out and criticizing and identifying, and often I think rightfully so, people like Adorno show you much earlier that these are social ills that are outcomes of the capitalist process, basically. And that's why I think Adorno is so useful and timely, and especially for people who watch Jordan Peterson and like him or whatever, this is the problem with Jordan Peterson is like he ultimately re-territorializes on capitalism and individualism and a kind of, very pretty standard kind of set of recipes or solutions for our cultural pathologies. He's very favorable to capitalism, basically. And this is basically the big gap in Jordan Peterson's project. I think, right, coming from someone who's quite sympathetic to his work, almost even a fan. If that didn't sound so embarrassing, I'd be willing to say that. The major problem is that I basically already said it. As the Frankfurt School showed, perhaps more brilliantly than any group, like the equilibrium, the cultural equilibrium, the long run cultural tendencies of a capitalist economy give you all of the kind of postmodern horrors that people like Peterson are like so panicky about. So yeah, that's why I think the Frankfurt School is really valuable today.
Well, the thing I would add to that, I mean, the first thing I was going to say about Adorno, what drew me to Adorno was he's sort of this like tragic character in so many ways, especially when you read Minima Moralia.
It's so sad. Oh my God. It's so beautiful. I really, really love that book.
It's a wonderful book. It's a very short read. I believe,
man, is it depressing? Like if you're not in a good state of mind, if you're at all depressed or anxious, do not read Minima Moralia because it will just pull you down, man.
Well, it was written during his exile in California
Okay.
because he and the other Frankfurt School friends of his had to move to the U.S. and exile themselves during the reign of the Third Reich.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting because another part of the sort of Frankfurt School conspiracy theories is that they influenced Hollywood and they infiltrated Hollywood, and that's how we get all this quote unquote cultural Marxism.
Right.
But Adorno was like a fish out of water in Hollywood. He's looking around the whole time and being like, I hate this.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone always looks back at the infamous, like, his hatred of jazz music. I mean, he was not comfortable in Hollywood. He viewed it as all part of this cultural industry that was just an extension of capitalism. He did not feel at home there. And it's kind of weird because his sort of, I think he would critique Hollywood actually, as part of the problem, which it's interesting that the right doesn't realize this about Adorno. In a lot of ways, he's very culturally conservative.
Oh yeah, hugely, for sure.
And I think you were also hitting on an interesting point. I was talking to a sociologist from, Australia the other day, and we were talking about Jordan Peterson, and they said to me, it's funny because Jordan Peterson is worried about the disruption of civil society, right? The breaking down, the fragmenting, and the atomization. But he's also
too late.
He's also but he's also very pro-capitalism and hoorah individualism. I mean, capitalism is the cause of that atomization.
That's
atomization, right. And we see that in all the sociological data. As people gain more and more wealth and accumulate more and more wealth, they sort of remove themselves further and further from the more packed areas of society where there's greater population density. So, I mean, the mere accumulation of capital seems to ultimately always lead to atomization. Yeah.
And I know like people like Peterson would say that's why they support, different policies to ameliorate the worst effects of capitalism. But again, that's why someone like Jordan Peterson really should read Adorno, because people like Adorno show you how deep the mental disease goes. You know what I mean? Like there are no policy fixes for the real roots of the cultural pathologies that capitalism generates, because it gets really deep into our own psychology. And I mean, like there's hardly any better kind of explorer of just the horrifying depths to which capitalism basically like rots our brains and our emotions and our tastes and everything. So it's like, yeah, I think that's why one reason why Adorno is such a useful set of insights into thinking about capitalism today, precisely because so many people want to kind of like talk about, moderating capitalism or whatever, but I don't think so.
Yeah. I mean, the other interesting thing about Adorno is that he doesn't provide any easy answers, specifically when it comes to concerns about fascism. Sometimes I'm reminded. I know some of your viewers are probably into like I'm sure you have viewers that are into like heavy metal type music.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, sure.
There's a track by this band called Napalm Death. They're like a death metal or grindcore band, and they have a track called Control, where the main refrain is there's a fascist inside you. And it always reminds me of Adorno, because I think Adorno was saying we're all complicit. There's fascism is almost part of daily life, is what he was saying, and we're constantly trying to resist it, but we're all part of, this struggle against authoritarianism while also, contributing to it at times.
Yeah. I think that's right. Well, I tell you what, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground already, and my voice, I think
I know you're tired. Yeah.
It's not, yeah. Well, it's partially that, but it's partially like I feel bad for my listeners. I feel like I'm scratching their ears with every word that I say, and I guess it is a bit of a struggle. But I mean, this was awesome. We covered basically all the bases that we wanted to cover, and yeah, we did an hour already. So yeah. Do you have any last words on the tip of your tongue or thoughts you were itching to get out? Because you could take your time with whatever. I'm not rushing you off. I'm just saying.
Okay. I would really recommend people check out the Parallax Views podcast.
Oh yeah, there you go.
I have the interview with you. I have an interview with Elliot Rosenstock, who is a psychotherapist that's involved in Cave Twitter. The Elizabeth Sandifer interview, which was the second episode, is all about neo-reaction to Basilisk. It's really worth listening to. And I'd also really like to plug modernmythology.net and the work of Jamie Curcio, who edits my writings at Modern Mythology. If you're into all this like weird subculture stuff, Jamie was laying the groundwork for that stuff, and he's also involved in the sort of what's now called alternate reality games, where people would create sort of alternate realities online.
Oh, really?
And create a culture around it where people actually started to believe it was real when it wasn't. Yeah.
So how does that work? Like, what is it?
Well, you see examples of it now in like these, the popularity of like Slender Man vlogs,
right?
Where they've created alternate realities and online alternate realities, and people become involved in the alternate reality game.
Oh, so you're saying he was like active in that early on?
Yeah. He was one of the originators of it, along with a fellow by the name of Joseph Matheny. And I would really recommend checking out both those names, Jamie Curcio and Joseph Matheny, because there's a lot of great potential in that kind of devilish pranksterism, you know?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't heard much about those, so I appreciate the leads. And yeah, thank you for sharing those. Cool.
Yep.
Anything else? Thanks for joining with me. This has been fun.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to do it again sometime. I was a bit scatterbrained. I hope that didn't bother your viewers at all.
You were. In fact, you come off as like quite a media professional because you do this plenty. So you came off great. And like people who do this sort of stuff, since you do a podcast, you know, this is like pretty second nature to you by now. And so like you might feel like you're having a bad day, and that's better than like way better than average. So yeah, don't worry about it. You're good. I quite enjoyed your comments, and you were very coherent, and I think we agree about a lot, actually, you and I.
Yeah, and the other thing I was gonna recommend, I may be doing a podcast soon with well, I've already interviewed him once, Alfie Bound, who has a book called. Yeah, he has a really good book out by Polity Press called The PlayStation Dream World, which is about psychoanalysis and the sort of dream spaces that come out of video gaming and how those can be utilized politically. And I'm going to be having him on my show at some point in the near future to talk about a recently unearthed screenplay. Recently released screenplay by the late Felix Guattari, Deleuze's old pal.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It's called The Love of UIQ. And I think your listeners should look up Guattari's screenplay. It was never made into a film, but he wrote it in, I think, he wrote it in, I think, 1987. Love of UIQ. It's Guattari's take on artificial intelligence. And it takes a very different view than Nickland. So
that's awesome. Thanks again for sharing that. I think you're right. I think a lot of my listeners will also be interested in a lot of the stuff you're doing. You know, your podcast and the kind of stuff you're working on is very similar to my stuff in the sense that, you know, I think we're both just interested in overlapping ideas and then just kind of like with a DIY mentality, just kind of creating the conversations and spaces where we pursue what it is we're interested in. And so those things you mentioned, I think are well targeted. I think a lot of my listeners will indeed be interested in the stuff you're putting out. So yeah, I definitely also recommend to anyone out there listening, check out JG's stuff.
Yeah, and Zero Books, since you know, I do freelance for them and they help me out a lot. So check out the Alternatives podcast with myself and C. Derek Varn.
All right, cool. Well, thanks again for joining me, and thanks for sharing all those interesting leads that, yeah, I'm sure people will find intriguing. So, yeah, we'll be in touch, and this is easy enough to do, so we can just do it again sometime if you want.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, dude. Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you later. All right, everyone. As you know, my voice is getting worse and worse every passing sentence. So I'm going to wrap this one up right now. No interesting or extended reflections on that conversation, but I thought it was interesting. I think JG's a cool guy. And clearly, I think he and I see eye to eye on many things. So like you said, go check out his stuff if you want to. Otherwise, I'll be putting up some stuff soon about my next streams. I have a lot of like interesting people planned. I'm going to be talking with people like Meta Nomad on Twitter, Friedrich von Exoskull on Twitter. I'm also going to be talking with Bright Abyss of Synthetic Zero, the website Synthetic Zero on Twitter. He's Bright Abyss. We're making plans to schedule a talk. So yeah, stay tuned. I'll be doing these consistently throughout the summer, at least. Hopefully even beyond that, but for the summer for sure. I'm really enjoying it. And I'm doing a lot of work right now to get cool people lined up. So stay tuned and yeah, come back for the next one. I will now go gargle some honey. That's right. That is exactly what I need. Dude, I would totally have Bronze Age Pervert on here, but he's not exactly lining up to do it. Maybe. I think Nishiki is trying to line that up. We'll see. All right, everyone. Thank you for hanging out with me. I wish you the best. Oh yeah, John Michael Greer. Actually, I do want to ask him. I think he does appearances like this. I think I might be able to get him. So it's good that you suggested it. That way I can. It always helps when someone suggests who I should get. That way I can kind of say in the email, my listeners requested you, kind of thing. Always helps. So who's Mannequin? If there's anyone else that you guys want me to get, it's best to email me or to send me a DM on Twitter so I can follow up, and you can send me links and stuff like that or whatever. It's hard to follow these chats. Oh, and remember, for those of you still with me, if any of you want to join the private chat community, again, leave a message on the video or shoot me a DM on Twitter or email me or whatever, and I'll bring you in. Logo, I would be happy to talk with Logo. I invited him, but he's a little, how should I say, protective of his precious identity, I think. All right, everyone. Thanks for hanging with me. Talk to you next time.